Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. How you doing out there, gang? The world can feel like a crazy place at the moment, but switching off the TV and speaking with you, my audience from all over the world, and the great guests, of course, are keeping me busy and smiling. So thank you from me. Now, today, I've invited Kathleen Richardson from Infor Pharma Intelligence onto the podcast, which is a data analytics firm for the pharma and biotech industries. And while many industries have needed to make their work more digital, the industry right in the middle, the pharma industry, has been painstakingly slow to adjust to these crazy times. So today, I want to explore the ways that the pharma industry needs to transform digitally. But I don't want to reveal too many spoilers before we get her on today. So buckle up and hold on tight so I can beam your ears all the way to North London so we can get Kathleen Richardson onto the podcast now. So a massive warm welcome to the show, Kathleen. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Sure, Neil. I'm the CMO of Informa Pharma Intelligence, and I am extremely proud to use data and technology to drive a true customer-centric strategy across organizations. So I very firmly believe in marketing-led business models, as you would when you're a chief marketing officer, right? Yeah. I'm also a very proud global citizen. So I've lived in 9 different countries, speak 3 languages fluently, and have working knowledge of another 4 languages. And I'm the happy owner of 2 passports. So I've seen a fair bit of the world, and I love to travel.
Wow, that's incredible, man! You've got me envious there. But Informa Pharma Intelligence is a data analytics firm for the pharma and biotech industries. But I am conscious we're going to have people tuning in from all over the world. They're going to be hearing about you for the first time. So, could I ask that you possibly set the scene and tell me a little bit more about your work and the kind of problems that you're solving with technology?
Of course. So, if you look at it from a very big picture perspective and in a very simplistic way, what pharma does is help patients get better, yeah? And how they do that is through kind of 2 big buckets of activities. Is first off, they create drugs through clinical development, and they get drugs to patients through a commercial launch, yeah? This is an incredibly complex, involved, expensive, lengthy process, Neil. So to give you an idea, the average cost to bring a drug to market has increased, for example, from $1.2 billion in 2010 to $2 billion in 2017, and it can take up to 20 years to get a drug to market. And so our data and technology enables pharma companies to drive and execute their clinical and commercial strategy. And in the end, we are in business purely to help pharma get drugs to patients faster and hopefully cheaper while saving lives in the process.
You were saying there that it takes so long to get those drugs to market, and the huge costs involved with doing that too. And of course, at the moment, there's lots of talk of getting a vaccine to market in a much quicker kind of timescale. Is there anything you can expand on there, and why that's a little bit different?
So it's not really different. So if you look at what is involved in creating and bringing a drug to market, right? Yeah. So one of the reasons there's been quite a bit to do around the Russia vaccine, and also some of the statements that President Trump has been making around the vaccine, is that there is concern from the scientific community, rightfully so, that the clinical development process will be shortcuts. And the reason the clinical development process exists is to save lives, is to preserve lives, right? So if you think about what is involved in developing a drug, is at some point you're going to need to test it on human beings. And you want to test that in a considered, statistically valid way, while not making anyone lose their lives over it. Yeah. And so there's concern about that part being shortcut, but what truly takes a long time is the distribution of a vaccine. And so I think that's going to be the tricky one. So when the UK government a couple of weeks ago came out and said, oh, we'll have it in everyone's hands by Easter, I don't know how that's humanly possible. So no, I think we're in this for still quite a while. Now, in terms of actually the vaccine itself being developed, one of the tracks that is being followed is the leverage of existing clinical development that was already done specifically around MERS and a vaccine for that. And since COVID-19 is a cousin, so to speak, of MERS, they've been able to leverage a lot of the work they already did for that one.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for helping me better understand that world too. And while many industries on the tech front have needed to make their work more digital, the pharma industry, has, a little bit like the legal industry, has been accused of being painstakingly slow to adjust to that digital landscape. Something that has been really exposed by the current reality that we all live in. But is that something you can expand on too?
Yes, absolutely. So traditionally, pharma has always relied on face-to-face interaction, and some of that is actually driven by the regulator, Neil. So if you look at on the clinical development side, there is face-to-face interactions between healthcare professionals and patients to manage the clinical trial process. So a patient can't get into a clinical trial unless their doctor signs them up for the clinical trial. And so that whole process has been put in place by regulators around the world. So it's very similar in the UK as it is in the US, for example. Yeah. On the commercial side, and this definitely happens in the US, you still have pharmaceutical salespeople visiting with healthcare professionals to get them to prescribe drugs to patients. Yeah. So it was a very face-to-face live business model that pharma was dealing with. And they were already starting to move away from that, both on the clinical and the commercial side, but they weren't moving as fast or as agile as some of the other industries that we have seen having to go through this change. So on the clinical side, for example, pre-COVID-19, there was already a push for what is called decentralized trials. Yeah. So where there is less of a face-to-face requirement and more of a technology platform being used to communicate with patients and collect their data. And the main driver for that before COVID-19 was an economical one. So when you require your patients to travel to go see a doctor a lot less often than they did in the old system, it actually reduces patient dropout rates. So they were able to maintain the patients in the trial. That in turn increases study effectiveness. And then you also have a way of gathering more diverse and accurate data sets. Yeah, so, and that in turn started benefiting getting drugs to market faster, which benefits, to be honest with you, purely economically, both the patients and the pharma companies, right? So the patients get better quicker or get a drug faster, but the pharma companies, by getting a drug in market quicker, can generate their revenue faster. The challenge for the clinical side has been that the regulators are very slow and have been very slow to issue their guidance on decentralized trial management. Yeah. So that has meant that because they didn't have the guidance, pharma wasn't going to invest in new technologies and processes to support those decentralized trials, because why would you invest if you might have to change it once the regulator issues their guidance? So, and in addition, because pharma is such a heavily regulated industry, it's actually quite a risk-averse industry. And as you know, any change in any industry involves risk, no matter how well you manage it. On the commercial side, there was also a push for digital pre-COVID-19 for similar economic motives. So if you think about it, nearly half of drug launches over the last 8 years have underperformed, Neil, and a quarter didn't even get to their sales target. So think about what that means purely economical for a P&L for a pharma company, right? And that has everything to do with continued pricing pressure, increased competition, And the pharma companies really not understanding HCP, so healthcare professional, HCP, and patient needs and preferences, which then in turn brought along poor targeting. So that's your marketing 101 almost. If you don't understand what they need and what they prefer, you can't target them accurately. So poor targeting definitely played a role in this as well. So to give you an example, over 30% of US and UK doctors now actually refuse to see pharma sales reps. So in this environment, pharma companies had already been looking for more effective ways to get drugs to patients that are far less dependent on sales reps having face time with HCPs. And then COVID-19 came along, Neil, and it's completely changed the reality for the industry and the regulator, to be honest, and increased the need to digitize. Yeah? If you can't meet face-to-face to meet trial participants or meet with HCPs to introduce them to your new drug or your new product, and you want to stay in business, you need to find new avenues and new channels to reach your core stakeholders fast.
And apologies for asking this because it's a pretty big question, but how can pharma companies then open their communication lines and stop relying on those sales representatives and doctors to reach patients and healthcare professionals? And what role do you think technology will play in that too?
So this is something that we're not just seeing in pharma, right? We're seeing it across all industries. It's what I like to call the rise of the millennial. And that's in a nutshell, essentially, that what pharma is dealing with, is that patients and HCPs are increasingly digital citizens. I will tell you a dirty little secret of mine, Neil. I'm actually a millennial. And I very much live my life online. Yeah. So to give you examples, most HCPs now, and you will have seen this if you went into a hospital or even your GP maybe, they use a smart device in their patient interactions to record input from the patients. And they also use the internet to research up-to-date information about drugs and diseases. And they actually know where they should go to find that information about drugs and diseases. Yeah? So patients use the internet in a very similar fashion. And that has meant, and I'm definitely one of those, that has meant that doctors are dealing with very informed, but unfortunately also very often misinformed patients. Yeah? And so this can actually in turn, depending on the information sources the patient has used, which either might not be the most appropriate for a patient because they don't know how to read the data, or they might just be blatantly wrong. And we have plenty of examples like that that are being highlighted in news and articles. And that can really complicate ongoing care and monitoring. And it might even go so far, Matt, that patients stop their care because of something they have read about their care specifically. But the other thing that has really started happening is that these digital citizens have also started looking at company values when engaging with a brand or a company. And they are looking for an always-on, immersive personal relationship. So millennials and digital citizens want to know that they're doing business and that they're buying products, whether that's a pharma company or not, from a company that stands for something bigger than just the economical benefits. So therefore, pharma really needs to use technology to truly understand their audience needs and concerns, to truly create audience-appropriate, correct, evidence-based, because this is really important content, to use the best-suited, reliable, trusted channels to reach those audiences and distribute the content, because not everyone uses the same channels and has the same preferences. And then to collect the data, they need to truly drive the patient-centric strategy they need to implement to overcome the current realities they are dealing with. And then they also need to use technology and data to optimize their processes, because there's no way you can do that with human beings, which then ultimately will help them get their drugs to patients faster and cheaper. And they will be able to engage other stakeholder groups, such as payers and pharmacists, to get a true, complete picture of all stakeholder needs, priorities, and challenges.
So many great points in there, especially about people self-diagnosing and getting things wrong. And I think when we've got things like the Apple Watch that's putting an ECG on somebody's wrist 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you can see why people often leap to the wrong conclusions. But I'm curious, how do you see tech improving that one-to-one interaction and building relationships and ultimately trust too?
Yeah, so to expand on that a little bit, Neil, so we live in very interesting time, as we touched on a few times now, and one-to-one communication virtually, I really need it and I really want it, and it's a real challenge for pharma. And we actually recently confirmed this again when we worked with UCOF to ask Americans directly about their views on clinical trials, and more specifically, the COVID-19 vaccine clinical trials. And more than half of Americans, for example, have told us they are not comfortable taking a COVID-19 vaccine upon approval because they have trust issues. They don't have trust in the process. They don't have confidence that pharma has their best interest in mind during these trials. And they don't trust the regulator or the government either, Neil, because they don't feel they have gotten clear, concise information from the government. So if we don't change this dynamic by prioritizing education and transparency to build that trust, we really run the risk of failing at our vaccination effort, yes, and which you and I both know could have very long-winded consequences. Technology can facilitate and support this shift towards more education and transparency by enabling pharma to reach their stakeholders, whether they're patients and HCPs, at the right time, with the right content, using the right channel. And this is also not a new concept. Other industries are already doing this. It is, however, a matter of pharma leveraging that non-pharma know-how to address the challenge and in reasonably short time, Neil.
So I've got to ask, what role is Infor Pharma Intelligence playing in this transformational period too? And maybe tell the listeners a little bit about the kind of problems that you're solving, because I think you've done a great job of explaining the whole landscape. I'd love to know a little bit more about what the kind of work that you're doing here too.
Yeah. So at a macro level, we provide the industry with market intelligence, insights, and analytics. They need to be able to drive their strategy when it comes to addressing the current and future challenges. Yeah. We also support their clinical trial strategy and protocol design, their regulatory compliance, the identification of strategic opportunities for partnerships, and collaborations and acquisitions. So if you think about it, if you don't have to reinvent the wheel because someone else already has the wheel, we can all actually help them find that wheel, which then in turn can shorten the time to develop something. At a micro level, we actually help pharma virtually reach specific HCP populations and individuals. And we can help them get them engaged with clinical trials and involved in strategic initiatives. Yeah? This in turn, again, helps patients get enrolled into trials and drugs to patients faster.
So what do you think the digitally transformed pharma industry will eventually look like? And what does that mean for third parties, intermediaries, or so-called middlemen and sales reps? How do you see that evolving?
Yes. So up to now, patient centricity was a little bit of a buzzword for the industry, and it has almost overnight turned into a reality. A real push for that to become a reality. So a digitally transformed pharma industry is truly patient-centric across the entire value chain, with patient centricity being at the core of its business and driving the business strategy rather than just being an offshoot or ad hoc tick box activity. True patient centricity means the industry will be able to get individualized treatments to patients faster and cheaper, which will increase treatment success rates for rare diseases, for example. And a digitally transformed pharma industry also doesn't just focus on temporary respite, but starts focusing on prevention and complete cure. I fully expect that in the next 10 years, HCPs will be able to predict the likelihood of a patient being diagnosed with a condition, enabling them to shift their focus on prevention. And pharma needs to be part of that shift, as it has a big role to play in prevention. Furthermore, the patient will have a communication channel and a voice directly with the industry. There's much value in engaging with the real patient for pharma so that they can hear their individual experiences, perspectives when it comes to the impact of the condition on them and their loved ones, and their experience while being treated with the drug. And it's also worth noting that the industry can't fully incorporate the digital transformation without support and action from regulators, Neil. So there is, for example, regulation created with the best of intentions that very much restricts pharma's ability to communicate with patients directly. And the internet, unfortunately, has enabled the spread of misunderstanding and misinformation on pretty wide scales. And pharma hasn't been able to weigh in with their knowledge, expertise, and evidence. Yeah. So there's a lot that could potentially happen as part of this digital transformation, and it very much impacts the pharmaceutical sales reps. They won't go away. I really don't believe that, but they will need to leverage technology to reach HCP and patient communities in new ways. Yeah. So, and they need to ensure by using that technology that they remain relevant and build trusted advisor status with the informed, empowered patient and doctor. Yeah, so social selling matters, not a new concept, and the pharmaceutical sales rep really needs to take that on board. Yeah. The pharmacy benefits manager is a whole different kettle of fish. So I really believe that is a dying breed and that there's a lot of disruption coming in that business model. So because there have been a lot of pressures and competitive threats for prescription drugs, they're really compelling pharma to look at new ways to get drugs to the patient faster and cheaper. When looking at cutting out several layers in the pharma distribution chain. Companies like Amazon, who have a huge supply chain mechanism, could play a really big role in solving this challenge. And that part of that could be cutting out the need for pharmacy benefits managers and maybe even brick and mortar pharmacies altogether.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk with me today and everybody listening. It's certainly helped me make so much more sense out of the industry and where it's heading and the role that technology is playing. But for anyone listening that would like to delve a little bit deeper and find out more information about Infor Pharma Intelligence and the work that you're doing, or even contact a member of your team if they're from that industry, what's the best way of doing that?
So our website is pharmaintelligence.informa.com. I personally can be found and contacted on LinkedIn, and I would welcome anyone to reach out to me through LinkedIn. And I can also be reached at informapharma@diffusionpr.com.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I've loved hearing about the ways that the pharma industry not only needs to transform digitally, but of course, but how it already is. And it's an industry I didn't have too much awareness around, but I certainly do now. And I'd love to stay in touch with you and see how that area is going to continue to be disrupted and evolve and move forward. So I'd love to stay in touch with you, maybe get you on next year and see how that journey's going. But more than anything, just thanks for joining me today.
Absolutely.
The pharma business model had worked for hundreds of years and was completely upended this year because people are now staying at home. And pharma companies need to be able to open their lines of communication. They can't meet them directly, face to face. And they also need to stop relying on sales representatives and doctors to reach their consumers. But pharma is an industry that isn't inherently innovative. In fact, it focuses on product innovation as opposed to internal innovation. So for me, it was very refreshing to look at innovation and technology and digitization from a completely different vantage point. But over to you listening. Email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, website techblogwriter.co.uk. Let me know what you think. If you've got any questions, anything else you would like to hear on this podcast, any topics you'd like me to explore, whatever it may be, you know how to get hold of me. But I'm afraid I've got to dash. I'm going to record another episode straight after this one. So I'm going to disappear now, but a big thank you for listening. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.